All right, last week we were discussing the matter of the sinner's prayer, and we talked about, actually it started with a discussion of does God hear sinners? And we noted what does the Bible, first of all, mean when it uses the term sinners? And there's two basic understandings or two meanings. One is that we're all sinners in the sense that all that are of accountable age have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But that when the New Testament uses the term sinners, it's talking about people who are not in a covenant relationship with God or are living in rebellion to the covenant that they have made with God. And then we noted also the word hear can be understood in a couple of different ways. That we can hear a thing, to know that a sound, or even to understand a thing, but have no intention to act on what we have heard. Whereas when, again, the question indicates, does God hear sinners? It doesn't mean does God not know if they're praying or not, but does God hear what they say with the intent to act on what is said. And the conclusion that the Bible teaches us is that God does not hear sinners in that respect. He knows everything that goes on. He knows every deed. He knows every word. He knows every thought. But so far as having an avenue of prayer by which God hears prayers and supplications and thanksgivings, He does not hear those that are outside in the gospel age. Does not hear those that are outside of Christ, outside of a covenant relationship with Him. In Jesus Christ, and does not hear those who are living in continual rebellion to the gospel of Christ. And then we move from there to the question of the sinner's prayer. And during the course of that discussion, one of my childhood friends who lives I believe he lives in Virginia now, somewhere maybe not too far from D.C., but I believe he's living in Virginia, asked the question, because we were dealing with Romans 10:13. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Also in connection with Acts 2:21, which says the exact same thing. Both of them are quotations from Joel 2:32. And in the discussion, because I'm not revealing anything that's not on my Facebook page, that he said I thought the sinner's prayer was Romans 10:9 and 10, not Romans 10:13. And so that came in right at the end of our discussion. I said I'll deal with that first thing, obviously next Sunday night, which is tonight. And so we're going to start there. We're going to go back to Romans 10. We're going to go back to Romans 10, and then after we deal with this, we will begin a discussion of some matters pertaining to the Sabbath day. And so, but with that in mind, looking at Romans chapter 10, the question was, or the statement was, I thought that the sinner's prayer was Romans 10:9 and 10 as opposed to 10:13. And so what I did was I tried to look at some specific, I tried to do some specific research tying these two verses to the sinner's prayer. And I was able to do that. Last week I was looking specifically at verse 13, and so I changed the focus of the research to verses 9 and 10, and there's obviously some things to be found there. But the text says, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. And therein is the text. Interestingly enough, the very first two results that I found that were specific to my search, in essence, you could tell, I don't know how familiar you are with doing a Google search or whatnot, but you do the search, and then the list of results comes up, and there's kind of a heading. If the page has a formal title or whatnot, that'll come across. And I found 2 pages by the same individual that it was obvious this person was saying the sinner's prayer, or saying Romans 10:9 and 10 does not teach the sinner's prayer. And so I thought, well, I need to look at this. I'm going to look and see what he says. And what it boils down to is that the guy who had that page, it was two articles on his particular website, is a Calvinist. And so what his point is, the sinner's prayer does not save, because you cannot add anything to what God does. Now, that's classic Calvinism. God has to save you. You don't have any part in it. God has chosen to save you before the foundation of the world. And when He decides to save you, you're saved, not according to anything that you have done or desire, or he said you're just saved. And he says to add. He goes. He was adamant. He's like moving your jaw up and down and producing sounds out of your mouth. I mean, he was like really adamant about denying the idea of the sinner's prayer having any efficacy to save. And so, he and I would both agree on that. The sinner's prayer does not have any efficacy to save. But we would be on the opposite ends as to the why. He would say, because God saves you and you can't do anything. In other words, to even imply that saying this prayer has anything to do with saving you, in his idea was heretical, because he had a Calvinistic or Reformed view of theology. And so there are others who deny the sinner's prayer for completely different reasons than we deny the sinner's prayer. And so that was one thing that I found. And he did note this, and this is also correct. Romans 10, 9 and 10 is not written to non-Christians. It's written to Christians. And the language seems to indicate that this faith that's mentioned in verses 9 and 10, or believing, and this confession are ongoing. They're ongoing actions. In other words, it's not just you believe one time, you confess one time, and you're saved. In other words, the language seems to indicate that this is an ongoing thing. It has a beginning, but it has to continue on. And the idea of the confession is also a continual action. And I had not, of course, I'm not a linguist. I'm not any kind of a Greek expert or any kind of spurt when it comes to the Greek language. But I think that was an accurate take. I think it was an accurate take on how the language plays out. Because in Matthew 10, Jesus talked about those who confess me before men. Well, that's not just a one-time, that's not just a one-time action. That's something that we continually do by the way that we live. And so he made the point that these things are ongoing. And I think he's right. And also this, that the word for confess is the word homologeo. It's a compound word. Homo meaning same, logeo meaning word or message. And so a confession in its purest sense just simply means an agreement on a thing. Now, here's a set of facts. Here's a statement, and we agree on that thing. So that's the concept of the confession. And that word is never used as a synonym for prayer. Now, there can be a confession, there can be a certain type of confession within the confines of prayer. But that word itself is not used to indicate a prayer. And he was right on that. Again, I think, obviously I think the application of his application of the text is wrong, but his understanding of the structure of the text is correct. And so there's nothing in the text that would imply anything with regard to a prayer. Now I want to note overall the overall context, because that's the biggest part to overcome if one were going to try to use Romans. By the way, I did find other websites that use Romans 10, 9 and 10 to defend the sinner's prayer. I mean, I found plenty of them. There were a lot of them out there. But there are a number of issues, obviously, that are going to prevent that from being the case. And one thing is to understand the overall context of what Romans 10 is all about. Because you're leading up in Romans chapter 9, where Paul is starting to introduce the idea that both Jews and Gentiles are all going to be saved by Christ. In other words, it's not a system for the Jews and a system for the Gentiles. There's only one system. But secondly is this. Romans chapter 10 begins in the first 4 verses by noting specifically that he's talking about the Jews. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them, Israel, I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. And being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, they have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law to all them that believe. Now, Paul's talking specifically about Jews. Now, in the overall context, he's teaching that all men are going to be saved by God's righteousness, which is revealed to us in the gospel. If you're here on Wednesday night, you know we've been studying Romans chapter 1, and that in verses 16 through 18 of Romans 1, the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. So we can't separate what Paul says about God's righteousness in Romans 10 and verses 1 to 4 from what Paul said about God's righteousness in chapter 1 and verses 16 to 18. In other words, if Paul's writing about God's righteousness here and he's talking about the gospel, which he is in chapter 1, and then we get down to chapter 10 and he's talking about they have not submitted themselves to God's righteousness, he's still talking about the gospel. You remember we did a study, and we've done this several times over the years, but made mention of how the Christian name came to be. That God gave the name Christian to His disciples first at Antioch in Acts 11:26. And we carried that thing all the way back to Isaiah 62, verses 1 and 2. When God said, I will give my people a new name. And then we said, well, when did God say He was going to give His people a new name? He said, the law of the Lord and God's righteousness will go forth out of Jerusalem. He's talking about the gospel. He said, and the Gentiles will see thy righteousness. What's he talking about? The Gentiles will have the gospel preached to them. He said, and then I'll give my people a new name. And so we want to properly understand what Paul's talking about when he's talking about the righteousness of God. In this case, he's talking about the gospel. They, being ignorant of God's righteousness and gone about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. Being ignorant of the gospel, they've gone about to establish their own righteousness, and as such have not submitted themselves to the gospel. And then Paul explains, for Christ is the end of the law. The righteousness of God is found in the gospel, and the gospel is about Jesus Christ. His life, His death, particularly His death and His burial, and His resurrection and justification based on those things. And so the opening verses of Romans 10 teach us first and foremost that Paul is talking about the Jews. He's talking about the Jews and how they have not submitted themselves to the gospel. All right? Now that's important for us because as we run through verses 9 and 10, which we've already read, Paul's going to carry this thing right back to the gospel. In other words, he starts with the gospel in verses 1 through 4 as the manifestation of God's righteousness. Then verses 9 and 10, and I'll read it again. If you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For, which is an explanatory statement, with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So verse 10 is an explanation of verse 9. And it says, when we believe, we're on our way to righteousness. Unto means going toward. When we confess, we're going toward salvation. It's not an accomplished fact. And one thing that we've studied a lot as we introduced Romans chapter 1 we can never get away from this, especially in Paul's writings, because, man, he was the master of the word for. I mean, Paul is going to for you to death, especially here well, just look in chapter 10. Look in your text, look at chapter 10. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to Israel, God to Israel, is that they might be saved. For, verse 2. For, verse 4. For verse 2. 4 verse 3. 4 verse 4. 4 verse 5. 4 verse 10, 4 verse 11, 4 verse 12, 4 verse 13. See how Paul just keeps going. 4, 4, 4, 4. What's he saying? It's telling us he's building this case all the way through this text. He's saying a thing and then he's building on it. And then once he's built this, he's going to build something else. And he's going to build something else, he's going to build something else. You know, because if we're going to be consistent, and when the Bible uses the term for, and it's the word gar, G-A-R, it means what you're about to read explains what you've just read. And as you can see, almost every verse, which, by the way, in verse number 6 to the end of verse 8 is a parenthetical statement. It's like you can just keep reading from 4 in verse 5 to 4 in verse 10. And so we want to understand that Paul... No, there's not anything that's disjointed in this text. Paul is building this case. And so if he's going to for us here, and he's going to for us in the next verse, and he's going to for us in the next verse, and he's going to for us in the next verse, he's going to call us all the way down to verse 13. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And that gets us right back where we were last week. And a study of what does it mean to call on the name of the Lord. And by the way, in this immediate text, look at verse 11. It says, for the Scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between the Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is rich over all who, what? Call upon him. And in verse 13, for whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So it doesn't matter if we start the discussion in verse 13 like we did last week, or started in verse 9 like we're doing this week. There's no disconnect between the entirety of the text. It all brings us to verse 13, and then Paul ties it in, calling on the name of the Lord, ties it in to obeying the gospel. Verse 16, but they've not all obeyed the gospel, he says. Well, in other words, everything I've been talking about is the process by which people are brought to the gospel of Christ. That the gospel's been preached, glad tidings of good things. They're in verses verse 14, but particularly and in verse 15. And so it doesn't matter if we start in verse 13 or if we start in verse 9. We got to go all the way back to Paul's initial statement of context beginning in verse 1, and that thread runs all the way through chapter 10. And so even those who do not agree with what the Bible teaches about obedience to the gospel also affirm that the sinner's prayer is not taught in this text. And I'll just remind you, David Platt, who wrote a book some years ago called Radical. And David Platt is from, at one time was in Birmingham, big church in Birmingham, denominational preacher. And, Platt created a hornet's nest when he said that the sinner's prayer is superstitious and unbiblical. And then all of his Baptist and Calvinist friends put the screws to him, and he walked it back. He walked it back. In fact, he voted to affirm it later on in that same I believe it was 2012 in that same convention. And so we're not the only ones that deny the Lord's Prayer. And by the way, you can find plenty of websites that have nothing to do with the churches of Christ that will say expressly, the sinner's prayer is not found anywhere in the Scriptures. And that is absolutely right. It's not found anywhere in the Scriptures. The prayer itself cannot be found. The practice of it cannot be found. And just simply on those two things alone, the sinner's prayer's got to be rejected. Whether you use Romans 10:13 or Romans 10:9 and 10. All right. Any thoughts or questions on that text? By the way, I really enjoyed that study of Romans 10, working on that. It's very, very interesting. All right, we'll deal with, I've got a number of questions with regard to the Sabbath, and I'll just deal with the first one. I'll just deal with the first one tonight, and then we'll move on to, hopefully I can get all the others done in our next session. But the question is, when was the Sabbath instituted? When was the Sabbath instituted? And there's a number of ideas. I have had to deal with Sabbatarians for 20 years, answering questions on house to house, heart to heart, and they're all the same. They're all the same. Well, let me put it this way. All of them I've ever had to deal with are the same. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but all of them that I've ever had to deal with are the same. And here's what they're going to do. They're going to write you a question, they're going to write me a question on the website and ask me about the Lord's Day or the Sabbath day or this or that, as if they have a legitimate inquiry. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes writing to them about what in brief, about what the Bible says about the Sabbath. And then about 6 seconds after I respond, I'm going to get about 10 pages of cut and pasted text. And it'll be in blue ink and red ink and black ink and, yellow ink. In other words, all they were trying to do is to get you to respond so they can blast you with about 10 pages, of cut and pasted material. In other words, all they do all day long is try to hammer their Sabbatarian doctrine on people. And listen. Every time when I get that, I always say, I apologize. I thought I was involved with somebody that was interested in studying the Bible and not just cutting and pasting about 50 pages of material. And that's usually about the end of it, because they're not interested. They're not interested in studying with you. They're just, like I said, cut and paste. And I can go back. I can get them off my old computer. It's always the same thing. It's always the same thing when you're dealing with Sabbatarians. But one of the things that they think points or proves their doctrine is Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. So we want to start there in our discussion of the Sabbath tonight. Because we're asking the question, when was the Sabbath instituted? Because instituted means that it was put in place, right? And let me explain what I mean by that. Did God have the Lord's Supper in His mind from the beginning of time? I'm just going to ask you a simple question. Did God have the Lord's Supper in His mind from the beginning of time? Yes or no? Huh? Huh? You'd think so, right? Well, let me ask you this. Did God know that He was going to send Jesus from the beginning of time before God ever created the world? Did God already know what was going to happen? That man was going to sin, and and by the way, if you have any questions about that, you can read 1 Peter chapter 1 and beginning about verse 18. You were not redeemed with silver or gold or by vain conversation received by the traditions of your fathers, but you were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, who was as a lamb without spot, foreordained before the foundation of the world. That solves it right there, right? God knew exactly what He was going to do in Christ before He ever made the world and before it was ever necessary for Christ to come and die. He already knew. All right, are we clear on that? So now let me ask you this. Was God's plan for the church in His mind? before the world was ever made. I mean, does Ephesians 3:9-11 teach us that the church was in the eternal purpose of God before the foundations of the world? Okay. So if God's plan for the church was in His mind before the foundations of the world, was His plan for the Lord's Supper in His mind before? See, now I've got all y'all on board. See, at first you was a little confused, but now we've got everybody on board. God had...
I knew that He knew that Jesus was going to die and all that, but I don't know if He had thought about commemorating it every Sunday. I didn't know if He got that.
And now you know better.
Yeah.
So we know, well, look, it boils down to, does God know all things? Yes. So he knew about His plan for the Lord's Supper before the foundation of the world. All right. So just because God had it in His mind doesn't mean that He instituted it, though, does it? Now, we all understand that our little markers or our little headers in our Bibles, like right before you get to Matthew 26:26, you're probably going to have a little header in your Bible that says, Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. And we know what that means, right? It means He put it in place to be observed, even though He had known all along exactly what was going to happen. Even though God had known from before the beginning of the foundation of the world, God already knew at that point in time, at that place, with those people, God was going to institute the Lord's Supper. So just because a thing is in God's mind is not the same as saying that He instituted it. You know, the church was in His mind before the foundation of the world, but it wasn't instituted until Acts chapter 2. So you following me? As Brother Myers said, are you with me? Are you with me? All right. So, Genesis 2, beginning in verse 2. I'll start in verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. That's after day 6. And on the 7th day God ended His work, which He had done. And He rested on the 7th day from all His work, which He had done. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. What means sanctify a thing? So He blessed it and sanctified it. What does it mean if He sanctified it? Made it holy, set it apart. Okay? He sanctified it. Because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. All right, so the text here says, now by the way, anybody toting the New King James like I am? Anybody looking at the New King James like I am? Yep. What's the first word in verse 3? Tell me, Philip. Then it says, then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. Anybody reading the King James? Rhonda? And by the way, I think if you were reading, I don't expect anybody's reading an American Standard, but somebody might have an ESV. Somebody that's got one at their fingertips. Sir? And on ESV, and? Yeah, New American, okay. Huh? American Standard, and. Hey, somebody look up an NIV for me real quick. What is? Okay, by the 7th day. All right, but look at verse 3. Opening. Oh, it says then? All right, so you have then, and you also have and it might be the Holman Christian, I can't remember, but there's a couple of translations that don't give any type of conjunction there. It just simply says, God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. Holman? Okay, I was thinking it was Holman. All right. There you go. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy. Now, the The Sabbatarians are going to say, there's the Sabbath right there. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. God blessed the seventh day. And therefore, the Sabbath has always been. In other words, they say the Sabbath precedes the law of Moses. And it's always been the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is the Lord's day, and it's always the seventh day. But here's the issue with that. Why would some of them say and some of them say then, and some of them say nothing at all? And here's the reason. There is no adverb of time in the text. The text just simply says, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. It doesn't say then, it just states it as a matter of fact. But even if it is then, is that an institution or just a statement of fact? Or did God institute the Sabbath in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3? He rested from His Word. That's right. Right. But people are going to say, but He sanctified it. See, verse 3 says He blessed it and He sanctified it. And they're going to say, now there's your argument that the Sabbath has always been in effect all the way back to the creation week. But see, my argument is this. Just because God did a thing doesn't mean that He instituted it for somebody else.
I took it that He rested.
Mm-hmm.
There's no mention of us.
No mention of us. And that's where I'm going with this. There's no mention of us in that matter. That God blessed it and sanctified it. Now,
there's nothing wrong with us observing that God rested on the seventh day.
Right.
He's not telling us to.
Right.
At that time.
Yeah, at that time.
Until the law of Moses.
There you go. Now, who wrote Genesis? Who's the author of Genesis? Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, except for the very end of Deuteronomy, because he was dead. All right? We figured that Joshua finished the book of Deuteronomy after Moses died, and then obviously he wrote Joshua's, was the author of Joshua, as we would expect. But anyway, in any event, Moses wrote a record of the creation 2,000 years after it happened. And he wrote Genesis 2. He wrote about God resting and sanctifying the seventh day after He had already given it to Israel as an institution and a commandment. And what you see what I'm saying is that Moses is writing about these things after the fact. Moses is not saying that God instituted the Sabbath. He's simply saying that God rested on the seventh day, and he's writing to Jews, and he's not writing to anybody else. And so he's reminding the Jews that the Sabbath day is connected to the end of the creation week. Not that God instituted it at the end of the creation week, but that He tied the Sabbath to the end of the creation week. In other words, the end of the creation week was not the beginning of the observance of the Sabbath. It wasn't instituted then. Here's another thing to consider. The word Sabbath does not appear anywhere in the Old Testament until Exodus 16:23. Nowhere in the Bible can you read about this. No, there's not one syllable in the entire book of Genesis about the Sabbath. We never read about God telling Adam. God said, tend the garden and keep it, right? But He didn't tell him to tend the garden and keep it except on day 7. We never have any record that Adam ever observed the Sabbath. Noah was never given instruction to observe the Sabbath. In other words, God didn't say, now 6 days a week you work on this boat, but on day 7 you rest. That's not in there. Abraham, never mentioned. Isaac, Jacob, the sons of Jacob, none of them are ever, do you not find that interesting that people would want to bind the Sabbath as starting in the day, on the day or the week of creation, and yet for 2,000 years nobody's ever spoken of as observing the Sabbath, and the word's not found anywhere. Because once the Sabbath is instituted, we find the Sabbath all throughout the Old Testament, don't we? And the New Testament. And so if God instituted the Sabbath, how come we don't have any record of anybody keeping it? It wasn't bound on anybody. Now, open your Bibles to Exodus 16, please. I want you to look at Exodus 16. The entirety of this chapter, I say the entirety, the lion's share of this chapter of Exodus 16 is God giving the children of Israel manna and quail. Because they're in the wilderness and they need something to eat. So they're getting manna and quail, beginning in verse 4. And in, let me see here. I'm trying to get down here to verse number 22. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." So they laid it up until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, neither were there any worms in it. Now this harkens back to the first time they went out and gathered, they just hoarded it up. And God told them, look, just get enough for today. But they went out there and hoarded it up. And what happened overnight? It ruined, it spoiled, got worms, it stank. But on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, and what was held over from the 6th day to the 7th day did not spoil or begin or to stink. And so in verse 25, it says, "Then Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath of the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none." This is the first time Moses has ever used the word Sabbath. And he's talking about the gathering of manna and quail. And he says, on the 6th day, gather twice as much, because on the 7th day, there's not going to be any there. Because tomorrow, I want you to rest. I want you to rest. Of course, some of them went out hunting food the next day. And God wasn't happy with that. But my point is this. If the Sabbath had been instituted at creation, and we're 2,000 years down the road, why is God through Moses having to explain the concept of the Sabbath to Israel? I mean, Moses is teaching them as if they had never heard of anything remotely akin to the Sabbath. And you know why that is? Because they'd never heard anything remotely akin to the Sabbath. They'd never even heard, let me say, it's not that they'd never heard the word Sabbath, because the word Sabbath means rest. But it's the first time they'd ever heard that word used to describe a day of the week with obligations attached to it. In other words, Moses is having to explain it to them. Now let me give you one more text. Look in Numbers 15. Look at Numbers 15. And I'm building this particular case to show that Israel had no concept of the Sabbath until Exodus 16. I said Numbers 15. That may not be the... Well, did I give you the wrong text?
Sabbath breaker stone.
Yeah, Sabbath breaker stone. Where is he? I've lost him. Where gathering sticks on the Sabbath day and the man was stoned. 13. Oh, I'm sorry. 15:32. All right. I had it right. I just couldn't find it. All right. Numbers 15:32. Now, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation and put him under guard, because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Isn't that interesting? From whatever time, from Exodus 16, and then when God repeated the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20 in the Ten Commandments, it was all the way until Numbers chapter 15 before somebody was found violating the Sabbath. And they didn't know what to do to him. Again, if God had instituted the Sabbath back in Genesis chapter 2, they should have known what to have done to the man in Genesis from the days of Genesis chapter 2. But it says they put him under guard because they had to go inquire of the Lord what was to be done to this man. Of course, we know in verse 35, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. What do we find here? People who had no idea, first of all, about a Sabbath until they were given instruction in Exodus 16, and then no idea what to do with a Sabbath breaker until Numbers chapter 15. In other words, the language of the first mention of the Sabbath and the language of the first violation of the Sabbath tell us those people had no idea. There was no history about a Sabbath until Exodus 16. And then it was codified. It was codified in Exodus 20 in the giving of the law of Moses and in the Ten Commandments.
Did they know then? When it was given as a commandment?
Yes, they knew in Exodus 20, but in Exodus 16 it was only given in regard to the gathering of food.
But how come they didn't know what to do with somebody from Exodus 20 to Numbers 16?
Because nobody ever violated it. Nobody had ever been found in violation of the Sabbath. And so when they found a violator, they didn't know what to do with it. They had to go inquire of the Lord. What's that, Kat?
Maybe he didn't know he was doing it.
Oh, he knew.
That he did.
By that time, thou shalt do no work on the Sabbath had been the law for a pretty good while, and he violated one of the basic tenets of the law of Moses. What were you saying, Rhonda?
Leading up to this fact, it's sin of ignorance in the verse right before that, is because someone despised the word of the Lord.
Yeah, look at verses 30 and 31. That's a good point, John. But the person who does anything presumptuously, whether he is native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord, he shall be cut off from among his people, because he's despised the word of the Lord and broken his commandment. That person shall be completely cut off, and his guilt shall be upon him. Now, the word had been given on what to do. They just weren't sure how to apply it.
I guess it just surprised me that it took that long for somebody to...
Yeah, I know the way those people were.
The way the whole world is.
True.
I mean, you give a rule and it's usually broken within 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just too used to sixth grade.
I was going to say, Moses didn't have to deal with American public school.
Well, they hear the thou shalt.
They missed the not part. So the idea of the institution of the Sabbath, or the Sabbath as an institution, is not in Genesis 2. It's codified in Exodus 20, but it's introduced in Exodus 16. So 2,000 years of human history with no observance of the Sabbath. Now, Lord willing, in our follow-ups, we'll talk about who was obligated to observe the Sabbath. Let's see. Also, was the Sabbath given as a day of worship? And then lastly, is there a Sabbath? Is there a Sabbath today? I was reading. I'm on an email list, like a daily list, and get articles and whatnot from Crossway. Crossway is the publisher of the ESV. And last week, of all things, when I was studying this, an article came in from Crossway where a man took the position that humanity has never been without the Sabbath, even today. So I thought, of all the things Crossway is going to tell us about, and by the way, I haven't looked at the article in depth yet, but that was the introduction to the article. Man has always had a Sabbath, basically from the beginning of time to the present day, and I thought that would be worthy of our examination and discussion. All right, good to see everybody tonight. Appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate especially all those that came and made sure your kids were here to go to area wide. Any announcement, anything we need to mention tonight before we're dismissed? Turn this on. All right, if you'll be on your feet.